Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a stack of sources and plunging into the history of two men whose ideological warfare didn't just shape their nation, but fundamentally split it in two.
That's right.
We are talking about Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, the Communist and the Nationalist, whose decades-long battle for China really defined the 20th century.
Absolutely. And look, this isn't just about two figures. It's really the history of modern China, a nation caught in this incredibly rapid, earth-shaking upheaval. So our mission in this deep dive is, well, comprehensive. We're tracking their parallel lives right from childhood poverty and struggle through these devastating alliances and global wars, right up to the radically different ways they govern their final territories, one on the mainland, the other on Taiwan.
Yeah.
We really need to find those specific turning points in the ideological compromises, the decisions that decided the fate of, well, billions.
It is just an immense story. I mean, it covers Civil War, World War, massive domestic failures, these contested legacies that still dictate global geopolitics today.
It really does.
The temptation is always to move fast to this stuff, but I think we need to slow down and truly unpack the causality here. What led these two men to such, well, diametrically opposed paths? And why did one succeed in claiming the mainland while the other was forced to flee?
Exactly.
Let's start at the very beginning.
Okay. So when we look at their contrasting formative years, we immediately see the kind of social fluidity of China right at the turn of the century. Mao Zedong, born 1893 in Hunan, his father, Mao Yichang, had actually risen from being a poor peasant to one of the most prosperous farmers and lenders in the area, owned about 20 acres, which was significant then.
Right, so there was some economic security there, but maybe not peace.
That's the crucial tension, isn't it? The sources point to a difficult home life. His mother, Wen Qimei, was more traditional, a devout Buddhist, but his father was hard, strict disciplinarian.
Yeah, the sources mention beating was the primary method of parenting.
Pretty much. And Mao later described this period as one of, constant rebellion against his father's authoritarianism. He famously refused an arranged marriage when he was just, 13?
Incredible. That young.
Yeah. That rebellious streak, that defiance of traditional authority, it really defined Mao early on. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek, born a few years earlier, 1887 in Zedong, he started out a bit more.
Okay.
His father, Cheng Xiaokong, was a moderately prosperous merchant. He had expanded the family business from salt into wine, rice, vegetables.
But that security was fragile, wasn't it?
Very. Cheng's father died when he was only 8, and that left his mother, Wang Saiyu, largely destitute.
Wow.
Yeah, Chang carried the memory of that loss, that struggle, throughout his life. He often talked about feeling, virtually orphaned. So the key takeaway here, I think, is that both men had these early lives rooted in traditional structures, but also marked by loss, struggle, and maybe a profound desire for order and control later on.
And they shared the same incredibly turbulent backdrop, early 20th century China. The Qing dynasty ruling for centuries was collapsing. It had forced the country into, 2 centuries of isolation?
Pretty much, yeah. And that isolation was just violently shattered by external forces.
We really have to pause on the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
1839 to 42, then again 1856 to 60. These weren't just about drugs, right? This was Britain forcing China to open its ports.
Exactly. And that flooded the country not just with foreign goods, but with these destabilizing modern Western ideas, concepts like republic, rapid technology, and crucially, radical political theory like Marxism.
A huge shock to the system.
Absolutely. So for Mao, who was still kind of intellectually rooted in traditional Confucian education, this was a chaotic mix. Our sources note he was reading incredibly widely in his youth history, traditional Chinese thought, but also the Republican writings of Sun Yat-sen, calls for democracy.
Soaking it all in.
Right. By the time the Xinhai Revolution, that's the army that really kicked off the collapse of the imperial system, erupted in 1911, Mao was 18, and he was ready. He jumped right in, enlisted in the rebel.
But Chiang took a fundamentally different path towards modernization, didn't he?
Totally different. He saw China's weakness not primarily in its social structure, but in its military structure. He was determined to build strength. So, as early as 1906, he heads off to Japan for military training. Shinbugakko Military Academy in Tokyo.
And Tokyo at that time.
Oh, it was pivotal. A massive incubator for radical political thought among Chinese there, all focused on how to overthrow the Qing dynasty, how to modernize China. Chiang committed fully to the military path, while Mao was still wrestling with these ideological concepts.
That distinction feels really important. Chiang focusing on military might from the get-go, Mao on intellectual rebel.
It really sets the tone for their entire conflict,
Okay, so the military path proved immediately relevant. The Xinhai Revolution leads pretty quickly to the abdication of the last emperor, Puyi, February 1912.
Yeah, the end of millennia of imperial rule, just like that.
And this brings Sun Yat-sen to the forefront, the provisional president, the sort of figurehead of the Republican movement.
Right. And Chiang becomes intrinsically linked to Sun Yat-sen and the Nationalist movement, which eventually becomes the Nationalist Party, the KMT. Sun Yat-sen's framework was the three principles of the nationalism, democracy, and welfare.
Sounds good on paper, but the promise of this new Republic of China, it didn't last long, did it?
Not at all. The period after 1912 just devolved quickly into the chaos of the warlord era. You had these regional military leaders exercising almost complete autonomy. The central government in Beijing was practically powerless through the 1910s into the 20s.
And that anarchy must have fueled Mao's radicalization.
Absolutely. It was the engine. By 1917, he moves to Peking, Beijing, works in the library, immerses himself in Marxist and communist circles. He apparently felt this profound alienation, what he called bourgeois hostility, the country boy among the city intellect. He was looking for an ideology that could truly overturn this fractured established order.
And then comes this international humiliation that shifts everything for China's intellect. We have to talk about the May 4th movement in 19...
Yes, crucial. Catalyzed by the outcome of the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. China was an allied power, right? But the Allies, U.S., Britain, France, they refused to restore the German concession in Shandong province back to China.
They give it to Japan.
Exactly. It was seen as this profound, just unforgivable betrayal by the Western liberal powers. And the sources show, pretty clearly, that this failure convinced so many young Chinese activists, Mao included, that Western liberal democracy, it offered no salvation.
So they turned elsewhere.
Sharply. Towards Marxism and Leninism, inspired, of course, by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1970, which seemed to promise this alternative path to national strength, social justice.
And Mao seized on this moment.
Immediately, showed real organizational skill. He mobilized student groups protesting the Japanese presence in Shandong. By 1921, when the Communist Party of China, the CPC, was formally established, Mao was already fully committed. He saw communism as the only way forward for China's...
Meanwhile, Chiang's solidifying his power base within the national...
Right. He co-founds the Kuomintang, the KMT, China's National People's Party, in 1990. And crucially, the KMT committed to unification through armed struggle. They recognized the warlords weren't just going to give up power.
His personal life sounds pretty turbulent, too, reflecting the times.
Yeah, he had an arranged marriage back in 1901 to Mao Fumei. It seems primarily for finance. It wasn't happy. He also practiced concubinage, took Yao Yecheng, later Chen Jiru. It was a common practice then, but it does sort of reflect this restless, maybe traditionalist spirit.
Until he married Soong Mei-ling in 1927. That sounds like a major turning point, personally and politically.
Huge. She was highly educated, sister of Sun Yat-sen's widow. That connection gave him immense political capital, linked him directly to the founder of the Republic. Plus, Chiang became generally monogamous after that, and Mei-ling turned out to be a really powerful diplomatic asset for the KMT, especially in dealing with the West.
Okay, so for a brief, unstable moment in the early 1920s, these two forces, KMT and CPC, were actually aligned, the first united front.
Yeah, the KMT was taking money and military aid from the new Soviet Union, and they allied with the tiny, nascent Communist Party.
An alliance of convenience.
Totally. Mao actually joined the KMT. He recognized the immediate need to overthrow the conservative establishment. He spent time down in Guangzhou, the KMT stronghold, working as a propagandist for both.
And that time was important for Mao?
Critical, because it forced him to engage with the sheer size, the potential power of the Chinese peasantry. It really cemented his later ideological break from that urban focus of orthodox Marxism. He saw the numbers in the country.
Then the dynamic shift. Fatal. Sun Yat-sen dies in 19...
Right. Chiang takes leadership of the KMT and immediately starts steering the party right. He was deeply skeptical of Soviet motives, increasingly wary of the communists growing rapidly with self.
Which sets the stage for the Northern Expansion.
Launched in 1920, the goal was mass. Crush the warlords, unify the fragmented country, establish a firm central government. Chiang started with, less than 100,000 troops? But the momentum was incredible. By 1927, his forces swelled to 500,000. They seized central China, established Nanjing as the new capital.
But the very success of that expedition removed the main reason for the alliance, didn't it? The warlord and the Beijing regime were gone.
Exactly. The rationale. Chiang became utterly convinced the CPC Soviet meant to hijack the nationalist movement from...
And that fear led directly to the rupture, the White Terror of 1927.
Yes, a violent, brutal purge. Under Chiang's direct orders, the KMT launched this systematic crackdown on communist cells in the cities they'd captured: Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou. The sources describe mass arrests, summary executions.
Thousands killed.
Thousands. Suspected communists, labor union leaders, peasants who'd rallied to the cause, wiped out.
The scale is hard to grasp. It was meant to be final.
Definitive. And this suppression, really, it effectively marks the de facto start of the Chinese Civil War, even though the official start is often dated a bit later to the Nanjing Uprising in August 27. But the alliance was irrevocably shattered. The war for China's soul had begun.
So the communists' first reaction must have been Chaos, retreat.
Total chaos. Mao and several hundred survivors fled into the wilderness, found refuge in the remote Jinggang mountain. And this necessity, this desperate situation, forced Mao to make that crucial ideological shift.
To shift away from the cities.
Exactly. Orthodox Marxism said revolution had to be led by the urban proletariat, the factory worker. But Mao looked around China's cities were controlled, secured by the national. He realized the untapped power was in the countryside, with the peasants.
So he abandoned the traditional Marxist path.
Completely. Focused entirely on building a revolutionary base among the peasants. And it worked.
How so?
Well, by 1930, he'd established the Southwest Jiangxi Provincial Soviet government. He started acting as a governor, a political leader in his own right. He now controlled significant territory and a growing Red Army, totally dedicated to guerrilla warfare.
Meanwhile, Chiang's KMT controlled the mainland during what's called the Nanjing Decade, 1927 to 37, a period of contradictions.
Absolutely full of them. On one hand, you see significant progress, real economic expansion, breakthroughs in the cotton industry, huge road and railway building projects, establishing proper banking and postal. Literacy rates improved.
But ideologically,
Profoundly conservative, traditional, fundamentally different from Sun Yat-sen's democratic. Chiang pushed this ultra-nationalism rooted in Neo-Confucianism and imperial. He promoted the New Life movement, a campaign for discipline, morality, obedience, kind of state corporatism with traditional Chinese values overlaid.
interesting how that need for order clashed with his management style. The sources mention he was personally erratic, intolerant, even violent with staff.
Yeah.
Yet he tolerated massive structural corruption within the KMT.
That dichotomy is key. We'll keep coming back to it, because ultimately it proved fatal for the KMT on the mainland.
But despite that internal rot, militarily, Chiang was focused on one thing, getting rid of the communists.
Eradicating them. He launched multiple encirclement campaigns against Mao's base in Jiang. Huge conventional military effort. The first 4 actually failed, largely because Mao was just a master of guerrilla tactics.
But the fifth one,
The fifth encirclement, launched in 1933, was different. They brought in German advisors, used a strategy of slow, systematic siege with concrete blockhouses, just choked them out.
and it worked.
It worked, overwhelmingly. The Red Army leadership faced complete destruction. So in October 1934, Mao, with about 86,000 troops, 15,000 support staff, 35, they broke out of the court. And that began the legendary, epic Long.
The scale of the Long March is just hard to fathom.
It really is. 368 days, 6,000 miles, an odyssey across some of the toughest terrain in Asia, 24 rivers, 18 major mountain ranges, and the human cost. By the time the survivors reached Shaanxi province a year later, only about 4,000 troops were left.
4,000 out of nearly 100,000 who started.
Yeah. But militarily, politically, it was perhaps the most successful failure in history. It preserved the core of the communist movement. And critically, it was during the march at the Zunyi Conference in January 1935 that Mao cemented his control.
How did he manage?
He successfully argued that the failed defense against the Fifth Encirclement because the previous leaders had ignored his expertise. He basically said, I told you so, now follow me.
And they did?
They did. The Long March was the crucible. It forged Mao's undisputed leadership over the sea, and it ensured that his new peasant-focused ideology would define Chinese communism. The nationalists pushed them out, but in doing so, they inadvertently created this unassailable legend for Mao.
And just as the communists are finding their feet again, the external threat explodes. Imperial Japan.
Right. Japan had invaded Manchuria back in 1931, dramatically raising the stakes, but Chiang, famously, prioritized wiping out the communists first. He had that quote right, the Japanese were a disease of the skin, but the communists were a disease of the heart.
Which led to that bizarre Xin incident in December 36.
Totally surreal. Chiang gets kidnapped by his own forces, led by the warlord Zheng Shuili. These nationalist commanders basically held him at gunpoint and demanded he stop fighting other Chinese and focus everything on fighting the Japanese.
Wow. And the communists negotiated his release.
Yeah, Zhou Enlai, representing the communists, played a key role. They brokered a truce, secured Chiang's release on the condition that he'd formally lead a unified national resistance against Japan. This led to the very pragmatic Second Front.
And then a full-scale Japanese invasion begins in July 1937.
Which accelerated that truce into a formal, if shake. The KMT retreated inland, set up their wartime capital in Chongqing. Both sides were now locked. Brutal 8-year war of attrition.
And here's where we hit that profound historical irony, isn't it? The great turning point. The Japanese invasion inadvertently becomes the communist lifeline. line.
Absolutely. The paths of the two parties just diverged violently during these war years.
Let's look at the communists first. How did they benefit?
Well, the Red Army was perfectly positioned for the chaos. Their mastery of guerrilla warfare, which they'd honed fighting the KMT, was highly effective against the Japanese in the rural north. They became the face of resistance in many, and as a result, Mao's Red Army just ballooned from maybe 50,000 to nearly 500,000 by the early 1940s.
And Mao wasn't just growing his army, right? He was consolidating political power.
Totally. He became chairman of the party secretariat, the Politburo, by 43. And crucially, he used this time to definitively state that Chinese communism would not be a Soviet puppet. It was distinct, national, tailored to that Chinese peasant reality well.
Okay, now compare that to the nationalists under Chiang during the war.
It's a stark contrast. Chiang consolidated control over the wartime government, yeah, but the KMT apparatus eroded from the inside out. That period, 37 to 45, was defined by rampant, just prolific corruption, and it utterly demolished the KMT's popular support.
We have to be specific about this corruption. It sounds like the fatal flaw.
It really was. KMT officials systematically embezzled enormous sums of money, including, critically, American and British military and financial aid that was meant for fighting Japan.
Yeah, I remember reading about General Stilwell, the American commander.
Joseph Stilwell, yeah. He became a fierce critic of Chiang, detailing how the theft was paralyzing the war effort.
Did Chiang himself benefit, or was he just letting it happen?
The sources suggest Chiang himself wasn't hoarding massive personal fortunes, but he absolutely turned a blind eye, especially among close family members like his brother-in-law, Kum Chang-si.
And the impact of that.
Devastating. When KMT troops went hungry or unpaid, when aid failed to reach the people, they looked around and saw the relatively disciplined communists as the only honest alternative. The KMT's internal rot just completely undermined their mandate to rule.
So Allied support after Pearl Harbor in 41, which was meant to save China,
it just prolonged the suffering in many and actually supplied the very system of corruption that benefited the KM. Chiang was important diplomatically. He attended the Cairo conference with Roosevelt and Churchill in 43, but American trust just withered once they saw the scale of the graft.
So the ultimate irony of the Japanese invasion
is this. It forced Chiang to expend his best conventional troops defending cities and railways, leaving the vast rural areas, the hinterland, open. And it was in that vacuum, often abandoned by the corrupt KM, that the communists strengthened. It perfectly set the stage for the final conflict. By 1942, that uneasy truce was basically meaningless anyway, and open fighting between the KMT and had already...
Okay, so World War II ends suddenly. August 45. Atomic bombs, Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan surrenders.
And the Chinese Civil War resumes instantly, at maximum intensity.
And Mao was in a much stronger position now.
Far, far stronger than anyone outside the CPC really understood. He got a huge early advantage in 46 when Stalin handed over control of Japanese captured territory in Manchuria with all its industry. Basically supplied Mao's war machine.
And the fighting.
Brutal. But the momentum was just inexorable. The communists secured northern China, two absolutely decisive, crushing victories. The Huihai campaign in late 48 and the Pingjin campaign. These battles resulted in the death, capture, or wounding of over 500,000 nationalists. It effectively sealed the fate of the mainland.
And Mao was confident. He didn't want a coalition.
Not at all. He had the advantage, and he pushed for total victory. He actually defied Stalin's personal advice to form a coalition government with the Nationalists. He pressed the attack. By spring 49, the Red Army was driving south, crossing the Yang.
The nationalist capital in Nanjing fell in April 49.
Yeah. Chiang technically stepped down as president for a bit, but he remained the real military and political commander, frantically overseeing this gradual withdrawal of assets, personnel, everything.
Which led to this strategic retreat to Taiwan, or Formosa, as it was known then.
Right. A massive undertaking. A logistical marvel in its way. Chiang and the KMT leadership oversaw the evacuation of remaining nationalist forces, government gold reserve, currency, priceless cultural artifact, the stuff that's now in Taiwan's National Palace Museum, and about 2.2 million people, military personnel, throughout the second half of 1949.
And the world map changed.
Fundamentally, October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, on the mainland. Meanwhile, Chiang establishes the Government of the Republic of China, ROC, in Taipei, claiming it's the only legitimate continuation of the 1911 Republic. The two Chinas were now real, separated by that narrow...
Okay, let's shift to governing these two Chinas, starting with Mao's PRC, those first couple of decades, 49 to 76. Sounds like a period of huge upheaval.
Immense ideological experimentation and, frankly, immense suffering. Power consolidation was immediate. Mao secured crucial Soviet financial support, tech advisors, between 49 and 50. Though, interestingly, that agreement required him to temporarily acknowledge Stalin's leadership in the communist world.
And the early reforms were quite dramatic.
Extremely. The land reform campaign was this massive, often violent, transfer of land from former landlords to poorer peasants. Sources estimate hundreds of thousands of landlords were executed, often publicly by peasant tribunals.
Wow.
Yeah, followed by a huge crackdown on social issues, opium production, consumption. Millions of users, former KMT members, sent off to forced labor.
And internationally.
The PRC jumped right onto the global stage by intervening in the Korean War, 50 to 53, ended in a stalemate, but it cemented decades of hostility with the U.S. and led to that crippling trade embargo that lasted pretty much until the 70s.
Then came the focus on industrialization, following the Soviet model, the first 5-year plan.
That's exactly, 53 to 57. Aimed to rapidly industrialize China away from farm. Fueled by Soviet aid, you saw factories, dams, railways built everywhere. And economically, it was a huge success initially. Industrial output increased 128%. Steel production jumped from just over 1 million tons to over 5 million tons a year.
But that success led to hubris.
Directly to Mao's hubris, yeah. And the next catastrophe. He started seeing himself as the preeminent global communist leader, got into this rival Khrushchev in the Soviet. Mao basically decided China would surpass Britain's economy in just 15 years. He'd proven military and political dominance. Now he wanted economic.
Which kicked off the Great Leap Forward, 58 to 62.
Right. And the policies were just catastrophically flawed, fueled by rapid, massive collectivization of farming into huge communes, forced implementation of experimental, scientifically nonsensical farming methods based partly on that flawed Soviet pseudoscience, Lysenkoism.
And the focus on steel.
Yeah, this drive to rapidly increase grain and steel output. The government mobilized farmers into huge engineering projects, pulling them away from fields during planting and harvesting. At the same time, you had the infamous backyard furnaces.
Ah, yes, I read about those.
Local officials, desperate to meet impossible quotas, encouraged everyone to melt down any metal they could find, including essential farming tools, pot, pans, leading to this massive production of totally useless, low-quality pig iron.
And the grain situation.
Made worse by systematic deception. Local officials wildly inflated harvest numbers to Mao and the central government, who then, believing the numbers, continued demanding grain exports to, keep up appearances internationally.
So agricultural collapse, misplaced labor, and lies.
Ensured the famine was unavoidable.
The scale of that famine? The death toll estimate's vast.
Almost impossible to truly comprehend. Estimates range from 25 million up to a high of maybe 5 million people. The Great Leap Forward stands as the single most catastrophic famine in humanity, just by sheer numbers.
And the political fallout for Mao.
Devastating, but temporary. He faced intense internal criticism. He actually lost the chairmanship of the PRC, the head of state role in 59, to Liu Shaoqi, though crucially, he kept leadership of the party and the military.
But that loss of control, the rivals multiplying, that fueled the next project.
Exactly. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1970, launched ostensibly to purge the party of bourgeois bureaucracy, keep the revolution pure. But fundamentally, it was Mao's ruthless, brutal attempt to regain absolute control and purge his perceived enemies, specifically leaders like Deng Xiaoping, who'd gained power after the Great Leap Forward disaster.
And he unleashed the youth, the Red Guards.
Urged them to rise up, bombard the headquarters, encouraged them to target the four old ideas, old customs, old habits, old culture. What followed was the Red Terror, a decade of intense nationwide social and political violence. Peaked between 66 and 71.
What kind of violence are we talking?
Students attacking teachers, public humiliation, murder of intellectuals, officials, a complete breakdown of legal order. Death estimates range from 500,000 to maybe 2 million. And to show the sheer breakdown, sources confirm systematic, politically motivated cannibalism in Guangxi province. The death toll there alone was maybe 100,000 to 150,000. Just horrific depths of ideological frenzy.
Unbelievable. And internationally during this time.
Mao firmly established China's independence. The Sino-Soviet split became final when Mao denounced Khrushchev in 61 as a revisionist traitor. China got nuclear weapons in 64. And then, surprisingly, by 72, the relationship with the U.S. started to thaw, leading to Nixon's historic visit. Geopolitics trumped ideology in that.
Okay, let's pivot to Chiang's ROC on Taiwan. 49 to 70, a very different picture.
Very different, but also authoritarian in its own. Chiang immediately established rule through martial law, which stayed in place for decades. He implemented his own systematic repression campaign, often called the White Terror in Taiwan, which actually lasted well into the 1980s.
Ma'am did who?
The most brutal phase was the early 50s, focused on suppressing any opposition suspected communist infiltrators, sure, but also Taiwanese independence advocates. Tens of thousands were imprisoned, about 1,000. And the memory of an earlier crackdown, the 1947 February 28, really solidified Chiang's image as an authoritarian ruler in many times.
Did Mao ever try to invade Taiwan?
He had an early opportunity but chose not, focusing on consolidating mainland control and Korea. After the Korean War, the U.S. formally committed to Taiwan's defense, the Formosa Resolution 55, and even threatened a nuclear response invasion.
But Chiang never gave up hope of retaking.
Never. Ever the military. He kept developing these elaborate, though ultimately shelved, invasion. Project National Glory in the early 60s, for instance, which ironically hoped to capitalize on the chaos and famine caused by Mao's Great Forward.
But the real legacy of the ROC on Taiwan was economic.
Yes, the transformation was incredible. Chiang started with protectionist policy, but reforms around 1959 prioritized market liberalization, massive land reform, much less violent than the mainland's, and, crucially, foreign investment.
And this led to the Taiwan miracle.
Absolutely. Sustained 10% annual GDP growth through the 60s and 70s. They focused strategically on developing these highly competitive small and medium-sized co-ops. You know that example about umbrellas?
Tell me.
By the 1970s, Taiwan was producing and exporting so many umbrellas, they cornered 75% of the entire world market. That successful foundation then allowed them to pivot into more sophisticated manufacturing, like semiconductors, where they're a giant today.
But diplomatically, things changed dramatically in 1971.
Yeah, that was the big blow. As the U.S. moved towards normalizing relations with Beijing, the UN passed Resolution 2758. It expelled the ROC Taiwan from the Security Council and recognized the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China. Chiang's regime became almost completely isolated diplomatically, even as its economy was booming.
So the era defined by these two men ends pretty quickly in the mid-70s.
Right. Chiang Kai-shek died in April 1975, age 87, succeeded by his son, Chiang Jing-kuo, who, despite his own authoritarian background, actually began the slow, cautious transition towards democracy.
And Mao
died just over a year later, September 1976, age 82. He'd tried to leave his loyalist faction, the Gang of Four, led by his wife Jiang Qing, in power. But they were arrested almost immediately, purged by the pragmatists like Deng Xiaoping, who then started steering China away from Mao's ideological chaos towards economic.
Mao's legacy remains incredibly contested, doesn't it?
Profoundly, painfully so. For many, he's just a brutal tyrant, responsible for, 50 to 80 million premature deaths, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, other disasters. This view focuses on his pathological desire for control, the consequences of his utopian hubris.
But there's another view.
Yes, the view of him as the indispensable hero of modern China. The man who saved the communist movement on the Long March, led the resistance against Japan, unified China after a century of fragment. This perspective highlights the dramatic improvements in life expectancy, literacy, infrastructure built during his rule, despite the horror.
How do scholars try to square that circle?
Well, some debate tries to distinguish Mao from dictators like Hitler or Stalin. They argue that while Mao's policies caused arguably more death, his catastrophic decisions, like the Great Leap Forward, were aimed, at least in his mind, at drastically improving the economy, achieving this ideological utopia. So his reign becomes this chilling testament to the scale of suffering possible when rigid ideology forces utopian experiments onto unprepared.
And Chiang's legacy, also complex.
Equally complex. He's the flawed savior who ensured an alternative, non-communist China survived on Taiwan. Without his determination, the ROC would have been finished. But that legacy, deeply stained by the corruption that cost him the mainland and the authoritarianism, the white terror that colors his memory in modern democratic Taiwan.
And crucially, their successors took radically different paths.
Totally different. Deng Xiaoping, on the mainland, moved towards this autocratic, market-driven pseudo-capitalism. Chiang Ching-kuo in Taiwan moved towards multi-party democracy.
But that historical tension, that original split, remains.
Absolutely. China views Taiwan as an inseparable breakaway province lost during the Civil War. That historical battle between Mao and Chiang in the 20th century directly defines the tension across the Taiwan Strait today. It's arguably the single most significant geopolitical flashpoint we face.
Well, this has been a really necessary deep look into one of the most complex struggles in modern history. We've unpacked how that KMT internal corruption was just its fatal vulnerability, how the Japanese invasion, ironically, became a savior for the communists, and the just staggering human cost of Mao's ideological experiments, particularly the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, and if we connect this whole historical battle to the deeper insight, you see the conflict between Mao and Chiang wasn't just military, it was this defining clash between two competing visions for modern China. One was traditional, conservative, ultimately fatally corrupted. The other was radically revolutionary, utopian, and just pathologically violent in how it was carried out.
So as you, the listener, reflect on these staggering contradictions, relentless pursuit of power that defined both their lives, maybe consider this final provocative thought. Was Mao's lifelong commitment really to Marxist-Leninist thought and improving the lives of the peasantry? Or did he just understand, maybe very early on, that the most effective, the most enduring path to immense personal power lay through harnessing the revolutionary fervor and ideological control that only that specific doctrine could provide?
Something to
We'll leave that thought with
think